Have you ever noticed how easy it is for a conversation about peace to turn into a battle? A simple question about a teaching, a casual opinion about a sutra, and before you know it, sharp words, defensive tones, egos flaring like wildfire. It's strange, isn't it? The very teachings meant to end suffering, to dissolve the illusions of the self, somehow become weapons in a war of words. There's a story I once heard. Perhaps you've come across something like it yourself. Two old friends, both lifelong Buddhists, found themselves on opposite ends of a heated online debate. It started innocently enough. One posted a quote from a revered Zen master. The other disagreed with its interpretation. Words were exchanged. Passions rose. Comments turned sharp, then personal. Soon, their friends joined in, choosing sides like soldiers before battle. What began as a discussion about awakening became a spectacle of anger and pride. And by the end, neither side felt any closer to wisdom, only exhausted, divided, wounded. It's not an isolated story. It happens everywhere in temples, online forums, social media threads, even quiet monasteries. But why? Why do we argue over something designed to liberate us from conflict? The Buddha, in his infinite clarity, once described the Dharma as a raft, a tool to help us cross the river of suffering. A means, not an end. Imagine someone crossing a raging river on a sturdy raft. When they reach the other side, would they hoist the raft onto their shoulders and carry it through the forest, refusing to let it go? Of course not. Yet that's what we do when we cling to ideas, words, and interpretations as possessions to defend. Somewhere along the path, what was meant to free us becomes something we use to fortify the prison of the self. The words of the Dharma, profound and timeless, turn brittle in the heat of argument. But perhaps it's not the teachings that are at fault. It's the human heart. The ancient masters spoke of the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's often these hidden forces that creep into even the noblest of intentions. A desire to be seen as wise, a need to be right, the fear of being exposed as unsure. What makes it so tragic is that it happens in the very space where awakening is possible. When we argue over the Dharma, we risk transforming medicine into poison. We trade silence for noise, presence for performance. And if we're not careful, we forget why we sought the path in the first place. It reminds me of another tale. A student once asked a Zen master, "What is the true essence of the Dharma?" The master replied, "A single clear word." But before the student could speak, another monk interrupted, declaring his own answer. A third shouted over them both. Soon, the room filled with voices, each one certain they held the key. The master simply smiled and left the room in silence. It's in that silence where truth resides. Not in the noise of contention, but in the quiet recognition of our shared longing for peace. And yet, here we are generation after generation, still tempted to draw lines between right and wrong, orthodox and heretical, pure and corrupt. The question is whether disagreement is bad. Disagreement, when approached with humility and love, sharpens wisdom. Even the Buddha engaged in debates, not to defeat but to awaken. The problem lies in the spirit of the exchange. When conversation becomes conquest, when a teaching becomes a flag planted on the battlefield of the ego, when winning matters more than understanding. Perhaps the true test of wisdom isn't how well we argue, but how deeply we listen. How quickly we can soften our stance when shown a clearer view. How courageously we can say, "I don't know." And so, this brings us to the heart of our inquiry today. Not to condemn debate, nor to advocate for silence at all costs, but to ask a question worth our deepest attention. Is the Dharma a tool for awakening, or a weapon for ego battles? And what might our conversations look like if we held each word with the same tenderness as a dying ember in our hands? If our aim wasn't to outshine, but to outlove, outlisten, out-understand. The Dharma was never meant to be a trophy on a shelf, nor a shield to fend off others. It's a mirror, a path, a gentle companion on the long, strange journey out of suffering. So, as we begin this reflection together, let us set down our verbal swords. Let us unclench the fist of righteousness, and with an open, curious heart, step into the deeper wisdom that awaits, not in the clash of opinions, but in the quiet spaces between them. And perhaps, as we continue, we'll rediscover the true nature of the Dharma, not as something to wield, but as something to become. If there's one thing that history has shown us, it's that human beings have an uncanny talent for turning even the most beautiful teachings into instruments of division. But the Dharma was never meant to be that. It was never meant to be a sword, never meant to be a badge of superiority, and certainly never meant to be a tool for proving who's more awakened, more pure, more righteous. The Dharma is a path, a direction, a lantern in the fog, not a stone to throw. You see, when the Buddha first spoke of suffering and the end of suffering, he wasn't delivering a manifesto to be debated, dissected, and defended like a set of legal doctrines. He was offering a way out, a way home, to the farmers, merchants, warriors, and wandering ascetics who gathered around him under ancient banyan trees. It wasn't about claiming who had the sharpest intellect or the most flawless argument. It was about easing the ache in the heart, soothing the restless mind, understanding why life feels like an endless turning wheel and how to step off of it. And yet, how quickly the human mind seeks to possess what was meant to be experienced. We turn Dharma into dogma, words into weapons, silence into slogans. But if we look closely, if we dare to peel back the layers of formality, commentary, and centuries of debate, we find something quietly revolutionary at its core. The Buddha called it ehipassiko, come and see for yourself, not come and believe. Not come and argue, but come and see, taste the stillness, sit with your own suffering, notice the fleeting nature of your thoughts, your emotions, your body. And through that, discover a freedom no debate can deliver. The Dharma isn't a position to defend, it's a practice to live. It's not what you claim in a comment section. It's how you show up in the quiet hours before dawn when your anxieties whisper to you. It's how you respond when anger tightens its grip around your throat. It's how you listen when someone else speaks their pain. It's how you soften, how you stay, how you let go. And in this way, the Dharma ceases to be a collection of teachings printed on brittle old pages. It becomes breath, becomes movement, becomes the tender act of being fully human, fully awake. There's a Zen saying, when you pick up the sword, you also pick up the burden. Every time we weaponize the teachings, using a quote, a rule, or a passage to belittle, to control, to outshine, we pick up that burden. A burden that separates us from others, a burden that hardens the heart, a burden that obscures the very truth we sought to uphold. But when the Dharma is held lightly, when it's approached as a medicine rather than a weapon, a guide rather than a badge, it becomes something extraordinary. It becomes the air between us, the ground beneath us, the silence that heals what words cannot. And here's the deeper truth. No teaching, no matter how profound, was ever meant to replace your direct experience. Even the Buddha himself cautioned his followers not to take his words on blind faith. He urged them to test everything, to hold teachings up to the light of their own awareness, to discard what leads to harm and keep what brings peace. So if your Dharma makes you harsh, if your practice makes you prideful, if your wisdom isolates rather than connects, it's time to return to the path, not the weapon. Because at its heart, the Dharma was never about winning debates in dusty halls or outshouting someone in the heat of an argument. It was about tending to this life, yours, mine, ours, with the tenderness of a gardener watering a thirsty flower. It's about presence over performance, compassion over conquest, silence over certainty. And perhaps, just perhaps, if we remembered this, the next time someone challenges our views, our instinct wouldn't be to draw the sword of intellect, but to ask a gentler question. What pain lives behind these words? What longing for peace is hidden in their defiance? And in that space, argument dissolves. What remains is the quiet, steady glow of understanding. The Dharma, in its truest form, is a home we build together, not a battlefield we fight upon. And in recognizing this, we step a little closer to the liberation we all crave. So, as we continue this reflection, let's look more closely at the roots of our craving to be right. What lies beneath this hunger to dominate conversations about wisdom? What old wounds, what ancient fears fuel this need to claim authority over truth? Because it's there, in the fertile, unguarded soil of our own hearts, that the real practice begins. Somewhere in the quiet heart of the Buddha's teachings, there's a simple, powerful precept that too often gets overlooked. It isn't about how long you can meditate. It isn't about how many sutras you can recite. It isn't about how clever your interpretations are. It's about how you speak, right speech. Samaveka in the Pali tongue, a practice not of restraint but of liberation, because words have weight. They shape the air between us. They ripple through the minds of those who hear them, carrying either peace or poison. And whether we whisper them in confidence or shout them across a crowded room, words have the power to build bridges or burn them. The Buddha was clear. Speak what is true, speak what is kind, speak what is timely, and speak only if it is beneficial. Not every truth needs to be spoken. Not every opinion deserves a platform. Not every clever remark must be delivered. In a world obsessed with having the last word, what a radical thing it is to hold your tongue, to listen fully, to choose silence when silence serves. But this isn't silence born of fear or submission. It's the silence of wisdom, the quiet of one who sees the futility in adding fuel to a fire already out of control. You see, when the Buddha spoke of dialogue, he wasn't picturing what most of us experience today, those performative debates where egos spar and nobody truly listens. His idea of dialogue was medicine, a conversation as a sacred exchange, not a competition, words as offerings, questions as doors. In the Sutta Nipata, he reminds his followers that noble conversation uplifts, heals, and untangles the knots of confusion in the heart. Its purpose isn't to win, but to understand, not to conquer, but to connect. And when we forget this, we weaponize language. We use the Dharma like a hammer, swinging ancient quotes and metaphors to silence others, to prove our superiority, to assert our version of rightness. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even a sacred teaching in the hands of an untrained heart can cause harm. The Buddha often warned against this. A wise person, he said, knows not just what to say, but when, how, and why. Not every moment calls for correction. Not every disagreement needs a public reckoning. Not every provocation deserves a reply. Right speech is not about being nice. It's about being true to wisdom. And sometimes, the most skillful thing you can do is to say nothing at all. There's a story from Zen tradition about a young monk who asked his master, "Master, what is the essence of the Dharma?" The old teacher raised his finger to his lips and remained silent. That silence was the answer, an invitation to look beyond words, because some truths, the deepest ones, live in the space before language. But when words are called for, when we must speak, let them be born from clarity, not ego. Let them be a balm, not a blade. If a friend clings to a view that causes harm, speak with compassion. If a conversation turns toxic, excuse yourself with grace. If you feel the surge of anger, pause, breathe, and ask, is this necessary? Is it kind? Will this bring peace? Imagine a world where this was our measure before every comment, every reply, every whispered word. A world where dialogue wasn't a means to dominate, but a tool to uplift. And here's the secret most of us forget. True wisdom is patient. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't scramble to prove itself. Like a mountain unmoved by storm, it waits, and when it speaks, it does so softly but unmistakably, leaving the world a little clearer than before. The purpose of dialogue in the Buddhist sense isn't to change someone's mind in the heat of the moment. It's to plant a seed of curiosity, of reflection, of gentle doubt in rigid certainty. Some seeds sprout quickly. Some take years. Some never bloom in our lifetime. But that's not for us to control. Our task is only to speak, or not speak from a place of wisdom. To remember that right speech isn't a moral commandment to be enforced, but a way of honoring the sacredness of human connection. Because every word we speak leaves a trace, a mark on the hearts of others, a reflection of the mind from which it came. And perhaps, if we truly understood this, we'd choose our words not like weapons for battle, but like stones for building, carefully, humbly, and with reverence for the fragile beauty of being human. Now, as we move deeper, it's time to confront one of the stickiest traps on this path, the craving to be right, the addiction to certainty, the ancient urge to grasp, defend, and cling to views. Because if right speech is about tending to the words we release into the world, understanding why we cling so tightly to being correct is the root of real freedom. And that's where we'll quietly turn next. It's easy to mistake the Buddha's teachings on right speech as a call for silence, as if wisdom lives only in quiet caves or beneath the shade of Bodhi trees where no voices clash. But the truth is, debate has always had a place in the spiritual life, not the kind driven by ego, by the lust to win or humiliate, but a different kind of debate, one born of mutual respect, humility, and the hunger for deeper truth. In ancient India, the Buddhist monasteries weren't places of passive agreement. They were alive with conversation, questions passed like offerings, challenging ideas, refining views, pushing past the surface of doctrine into the marrow of wisdom. There's a term in Pali, kathavathu, the topics of discussion. Monks would gather beneath trees, along riverbanks, or in shaded halls to examine difficult questions about karma, rebirth, the nature of self, and the workings of the mind. But there were rules, not rules for domination, rules for decency. A debate wasn't a battle, it was a practice. Before it began, each participant was expected to hold this intention. May this discussion lead to the welfare of both. May it clarify what is true and dissolve what is false. May no anger arise, because wisdom cannot grow in soil poisoned by pride. You see, in the Dharma, the purpose of debate isn't to defeat, it's to reveal, to strip away the layers of misunderstanding, yours and theirs, to hold ideas up to the light, not to watch them burn, but to see what shines through. The Buddha himself engaged in dialogues with wandering philosophers, skeptics, and rival teachers. And when he debated, he wasn't seeking followers, he was seeking clarity. There's a famous encounter between the Buddha and a teacher named Sakaka, a man known for his sharp tongue and love of public challenges. Sakaka was eager to humiliate the Buddha in front of a crowd, convinced he could trap him in contradictions. But the Buddha remained calm, patient, and precise. He didn't react to provocations. He didn't mock or belittle. He guided the conversation like a river around a stone, firm when needed, gentle when possible. And in the end, it wasn't through cleverness that the Buddha prevailed. It was through unwavering clarity, through a presence so steady, so unattached to being right, that it left no room for aggression to land. This is what skillful debate looks like. It's a fire that warms, not one that scorches. It's a process where both leave wiser than they arrived. And the ancient masters understood something we've largely forgotten, that sometimes we need others to challenge us, to point out the blind spots we can't see, to question the cherished beliefs we've never dared examine. But here's the key, it must come from a heart rooted in compassion, not conquest. A Zen saying reminds us, the sword of wisdom cuts delusion, not people. Meaning, it's the false ideas, the unexamined assumptions, the clinging to certainty that should be cut away, never the dignity of another person. In modern times, we're often too quick to either avoid difficult conversations altogether or to enter them like gladiators, armored in opinions and armed with sharp words. But what if we remembered this ancient tradition of skillful debate? What if, before speaking, we paused to ask ourselves, am I trying to learn or to win? Is this for the good of both, or only for the inflation of my pride? A wise teacher once told his students, if you must debate, let it be like two travelers lighting their lanterns from the same flame, each walking away with more light. not less. And perhaps that's what the Buddha intended all along. Not a world without disagreement, but a world where disagreement was a doorway to deeper understanding, where differing views weren't threats but opportunities, where truth wasn't something one person possessed, but something uncovered together. The Dharma isn't fragile. It doesn't shatter under scrutiny. It welcomes sincere inquiry. It asks to be tested in words, in practice, in the raw texture of lived experience. And so, when the time is right, when the heart is steady, when words can be offered without malice, debate can be a sacred act. Not every conversation is worthy of this. Some are driven by craving, by anger, by ignorance too thick to pierce. The wise person knows which is which. They know when to speak, when to challenge, and when to let silence do the work. Because in silence too, truths reveal themselves. And as we leave this chapter of ancient wisdom, another question quietly emerges. If debate can be skillful and silence can be profound, how do we know when to use which? What guides that choice? The answer, as you might suspect, lies not in words, but in the nature of our own mind. And it's to the craving behind our arguments, the thirst for certainty, the clinging to being right, that we now turn our gaze. There's a quiet danger in every conversation we enter, not in the words themselves, but in the subtle craving that clings to those words. A craving so ordinary we often don't even notice it. The craving to be right. It doesn't shout. It doesn't stomp its feet. It disguises itself in noble costumes, the defender of truth, the protector of tradition, the seeker of clarity. But if you listen carefully, it's the sound of the self grasping, the I desperate to be validated. In Buddhist thought, ego isn't just arrogance or pride. It's the illusion of separateness. The idea that this me is something solid, something that must be defended, maintained, and glorified. And nowhere does that illusion flare up more fiercely than in arguments over what's right. You've seen it. A conversation starts as a sharing of ideas, and somewhere, perhaps quietly, perhaps explosively, it twists. It stops being about truth. It becomes about my truth, my point, my status, my victory. And the moment that happens, wisdom leaves the room. You see, the danger isn't disagreement itself. It's when disagreement becomes personal. When our identity fuses with our opinion. When we feel that to lose an argument is to lose a part of ourselves. The Buddha warned against this kind of attachment, not because debate is wrong, but because clinging is suffering. And wherever there's ego-driven argument, suffering soon follows. Consider this. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling tight in your chest, replaying every word you wish you said? Have you ever caught yourself rehearsing comebacks to an argument long after it ended? That's not the mark of wisdom gained. That's the echo of a bruised ego. And the more we feed it, the stronger it grows. In the monastic tradition, there's a practice known as Dhammavichya, the investigation of truth. It's a beautiful thing when done sincerely. But even monks, those who have renounced so much, were cautioned not to turn that investigation into a competition. There's a telling verse in the Dhammapada. He who speaks only to criticize, who finds fault in every word, is like a hunter laying snares. The wise avoid such company. Because when arguments are driven by ego, truth is no longer the goal. It becomes collateral damage. And this craving isn't limited to formal debates. It seeps into our daily conversations with family, friends, even strangers online. A comment meant to clarify turns sharp. A sincere question feels like a challenge. A difference in interpretation becomes a reason to sever connection. Why? Because the I is fragile, and every disagreement feels like a crack in its armor. But here's the irony. The Dharma was never meant to fortify the self. It was meant to dissolve it. When we use the teachings as weapons to prove our superiority, we betray their heart. We turn medicine into poison. A Zen master once told his students, when you grasp the Dharma tightly in your fist, you strangle it. When you open your palm, it rests there alive. Meaning, truth isn't something we possess. It's something we serve. And the moment we start using the Dharma to win arguments, to elevate ourselves, to humiliate others, we've left the path. Even if every word we speak is technically correct, it's still wrong if it's spoken from a place of craving. Because the Dharma isn't just about what is said, it's about why it's said, and how it lands. A harsh truth spoken from compassion can liberate, a gentle truth spoken from ego can bind. So what do we do when we feel that rising heat, that inner urge to prove ourselves right? We pause, we breathe, we return to the ground beneath our feet, and we ask ourselves, is this for the benefit of both? Is this coming from love or from fear? Not every battle deserves our sword. Some deserve our silence. Some deserve our careful, patient words. And some deserve to be left alone like a fire without fuel. A seasoned practitioner once said, "I no longer debate to be understood. I speak only to offer what may be helpful, and when it isn't, I let it be." That's not weakness, it's mastery, because true strength isn't in crushing another's view. It's in knowing when to release your own. As we sit with this understanding, a gentler, deeper question arises. If ego-driven argument leads to suffering, how then should we speak, especially when the truth feels urgent and silence feels like surrender? The answer lies in the Buddha's teachings on compassionate communication, a language not of conquest, but of care. And it's to that wisdom we now gently turn. When a heart is weighed down by the need to be right, words become weapons. But when the heart is light, when it's rooted in compassion, words can become medicine. The Buddha never asked us to avoid difficult conversations. He asked us to approach them wisely, with care, and with the deep understanding that every being we speak to is carrying an invisible burden, a stranger in a heated debate, a friend clinging to a mistaken view, a loved one caught in their suffering. Each of them is, in their own way, longing for ease, longing for peace. And the Dharma, in its purest form, is a path toward that peace, not a hammer to crush another's view, but a lamp to help them see. So how do we speak the Dharma with compassion? How do we offer truth without harm? It begins always with our own intention. Before a single word leaves our lips, we pause and ask, why am I about to say this? Is it to uplift or to humiliate? To clarify or to corner? To heal or to prove a point? The Buddha taught that right speech isn't just about what is true, it's about what is beneficial, timely, and kind. A truth can be like a sharp blade, and while a blade can cut away ignorance, it can also wound if handled without care. In one of the sutras, a disciple once asked the Blessed One, "Master, when should I speak, and when should I remain silent?" And the Buddha replied, "If what you wish to say is not true, not beneficial, not timely, or not spoken with a heart of goodwill, it is better to keep silent." Notice the balance here. It's not that we avoid speaking difficult truths. It's that we deliver them the way a physician would, precisely, gently, with the intention of healing. Because the Dharma is not merely a collection of ideas. It's a living wisdom meant to reduce suffering. And words, when aligned with that purpose, can be powerful agents of liberation. Think of a time you received a difficult truth from someone you trusted, someone who spoke not to diminish you, but to help you grow. The words may have stung, but they carried no poison. There was no residue of contempt, only the steady presence of someone who cared enough to be honest and skillful enough to be kind. That is how the Dharma should be spoken. It's not always about soft words, but about soft hearts. Sometimes compassion means being direct. Sometimes it means offering silence. And sometimes it means wrapping hard truths in the warmth of understanding. In Buddhist tradition, this kind of speech is called gentle speech, not weak but wise. It's the kind of voice that knows when to challenge and when to console, when to speak and when to listen. And perhaps most importantly, it knows that truth without kindness is incomplete, because truth is a medicine best delivered with a steady hand. Nowhere is this more beautifully illustrated than in the ancient story of the mustard seed. A grieving mother, shattered by the death of her only child, came to the Buddha, begging him to bring her son back to life. The Buddha, with deep compassion, told her to bring him a mustard seed from a household untouched by death. She searched every home in the village, but every family had known loss. Returning empty-handed, her grief softened by the shared sorrow of others, she began to understand the universal nature of suffering. The Buddha didn't lecture her. He didn't argue with her mistaken view of death. He spoke through an act of compassion, allowing the truth to dawn within her naturally. This is the heart of skillful Dharma speech. It's not about winning minds in the moment. It's about planting seeds that blossom when the time is right. In our own lives, we can practice this in small ways. By asking ourselves before each conversation, is what I'm about to say spoken from love or from ego? Am I trying to be helpful or just clever? Will these words lead to understanding or division? And when we don't know, we pause. Because silence, too, can be an act of compassion. The Zen tradition teaches, do not speak unless you can improve upon the silence. Not because silence is always superior, but because words carry weight. And when we wield them carelessly, we risk harm. But when we speak the Dharma with compassion, when our words are offered like a cool drink to a parched traveler, they can change lives. Even a single sentence, even a quiet question, even a moment of presence without words. That is the power of skillful speech. It's not in the volume of our voice, but in the clarity of our heart. And as we carry this awareness into our dialogues, another question quietly arises. If the way we speak shapes the hearts of others, what happens when we ourselves are confronted, criticized, or challenged? How do we listen without defense, without clinging, without letting the ego leap to its feet? To answer this, we must turn inward, to the ancient wisdom of mindful listening, a practice not of passive silence but of deep, active presence. And that is where we'll journey next. There's a curious thing about words. They can build bridges or they can burn them. They can open hearts or close them. And yet, beyond words, beyond argument, beyond the clashing of opinions, there is something vast, silent, and unshaken. It's easy to forget this. In a world that thrives on debate, controversy, and the relentless need to be heard, we often mistake noise for wisdom. We defend our ideas as if they were our very selves. We cling to views as if our lives depended on them. And in doing so, we miss the one thing the Buddha urged us never to overlook, the liberation that comes when clinging ceases. This entire journey we've taken together, through the nature of Dharma, the wisdom of right speech, the ancient traditions of debate, the dangers of ego, and the call for compassionate dialogue, has pointed to a simple, profound truth. The Dharma was never meant to be a weapon in an argument. It was meant to be a mirror that reflects the true nature of things, a mirror that shows us our attachments, our fears, our vanities, a mirror that, if we dare to look deeply, reveals the face of awakening itself. And here's the paradox. When we stop needing to win, we win. When we stop trying to convince others, our words gain weight. When we release the need to be right, wisdom rises quietly within us. The Buddha wasn't interested in creating followers who could recite doctrines like soldiers memorizing orders. He sought to awaken hearts, to free minds, to guide people not toward better arguments but toward direct experience, toward that silent, wordless knowing that arises when we see things as they truly are. Because ultimately, the deepest truths cannot be argued. They can only be realized. It's said that when the Buddha delivered his first sermon, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma, he didn't end with a command. He ended with an invitation. Come and see for yourself. Not believe me. Not defend this teaching, but experience it. Live it. Let it soften you. Let it dissolve the walls you've built between yourself and the world. And when you speak, whether in Dharma discussion, a quiet conversation, or a disagreement with someone you love, let your words be shaped not by the sharp edges of pride, but by the quiet power of compassion. Speak as if the person before you is carrying a sorrow you cannot see, because they are. Speak as if these words might be the last ones you'll ever share, because one day they will be. And remember, every argument you avoid for the sake of peace, every gentle truth you offer without arrogance, every time you choose silence over harm, these are not small things. They are the seeds of awakening. The Dharma is not only in the temples, the sutras, or the eloquent talks. It's in the pauses between words, in the courage to listen, in the humility to be wrong, in the grace to let go. And so, as this conversation comes to a close, the real practice begins. Not in debates won, but in selves transcended. Not in cleverness, but in kindness. Not in having the last word, but in finding the first step. A step toward compassion. A step toward understanding. A step toward the awakening that was never anywhere but here, waiting quietly behind the noise. May your words be wise. May your heart be kind. And may the Dharma always be a path you walk, not a weapon you wield.